Welcome to a new episode of Culturally Appropriate. I'm your host, Jerod Hollyfield, broadcasting to you live from my suburban bunker. We have a wonderful show lined up for you today. First, we are going to talk to Chadwick Moore, who was the author of the new biography on Tucker Carlson that hit shelves last August. Next, we're going to talk about Sofia Coppola's new movie, Priscilla, based on Priscilla Presley's memoir. And as always, we will end with the weekly film rundown, giving you an exhaustive list of all of the movies opening up in Nashville this weekend. So I'd like to introduce my first guest, Chadwick Moore, who's had an extensive career in journalism before coming to a really amazing book on Tucker Carlson that is one of the best reads that I've had all year long. So Chadwick, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jerod, great to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. So for the viewers not familiar with your book, and I know a lot of people have read this book, I kind of came late to the party in terms of reviewing it, but how did you go from being a contributing editor to The Advocate and Out magazine to writing a biography of Tucker Carlson? Because that seems like a very interesting journey to me.
Yeah, it's quite a journey, I would guess. I've been in, mainstream media for a while and gay media. I was editor at large for, as you said, Out magazine, The Advocate. And, it was sort of building up and creeping that I was just kind of becoming more suspicious of my team and of mainstream media in general. And it really sort of hit a head in 2016 and especially after the election of when Donald Trump won the election, where I just began, questioning things. And there've been a few pieces I'd written kind of leading up to that. And I, in February 2017, right after the inauguration of Trump, I penned a piece for the New York Post, coming out as conservative, as politically more conservative. I don't even know if I'd call myself actually conservative. I don't even know what conservative liberally means anymore. But I came out and just sort of called out what I saw as bad behavior on my side, and came out as, I thought it was a very innocent piece, and just sort of said, I believe in free speech, and I believe in the Constitution, and I believe that the media is somewhat corrupt, and I don't think Donald Trump is evil or Nazi or what have you. As I said, I thought it was like totally innocent. I didn't really think much would happen, but the piece went, completely viral, and that's when I got on Tucker's radar, or at least his team's radar. Excuse me. And they invited me on the show because of the piece, and that was on a Tuesday in February, and that was like my second or third time on television, and my first time at Fox News, and that's sort of how I got into his orbit. And the day after that aired, I was fired from Out in The Advocate and let go from all the other places I was freelancing from, and then also lost all my friends and all that stuff as was in vogue at the time. And but then Tucker kept asking me on his show, so I was like a regular guest on his show for basically the entire run of the show, even on the last episode, which was April 21st, weirdly enough, because none of us knew that would be the last episode. So that's sort of how I at least I always kind of knew who he was, but didn't really pay attention to him. I knew him as, that kind of fratty guy in the bow tie on CNN or whatever. And that's about all I knew about Tucker until that moment. And then obviously I know a lot about him now after writing the biography.
A lot of people would say what happened to you doesn't actually happen. That if somebody writes a fairly innocent piece that goes a little bit against the party line, that the other side is understanding. So, I mean, was it, I don't want to get too much into personal details, but was it a situation of like, you wrote this, we don't agree with it, you're fired? Or, I mean, that's how it went down?
I mean, that's the nice way to put it. No, it wasn't even that. I mean, they couldn't, I think for legal reasons, it's funny because I live in New York, which is one of only two states, New York and California, where actually you can't fire someone over political differences. That was something that the communists put in decades ago because they were worried about being red listed. So, I could have sued. I didn't, because I thought that would have been nasty. But it was, no, I mean, it was like it was, I was called every horrible thing in the book, and I'm a racist, I'm a Nazi, I'm a everything that they say. It's funny. It's funny. I remember all those think pieces being like, "Oh, cancel culture isn't real; it doesn't exist," and that's so funny because, of course, it does. And it was all coming from one side, obviously, and that's the left. It's funny now to see cancel culture coming for the other side. It's I mean, it's sort of strange and that it took Israel to do that. And I'm against cancel culture, I suppose, but as someone who's survived it many times and really doesn't care anymore, it's obviously like entertaining to watch it happen. And I'm here for it. I don't care. I think it's hilarious. Cancel them. Who cares? This is the world that they created. You know, none of us asked for this. We didn't want this. Our side did not want this, but they made the rules. So here we go. I hope it continues. I hope they continue to get canceled. You know, once you survive that stuff, that wasn't the, you know, I've been canceled a couple times since then. And, you know, once you survive it, it's not that big of a deal. I mean, it's sort of hilarious and you know, you have to laugh at it. We're only alive for so long, you know what I mean? And you have to enjoy life and you have to laugh at things like that. But it's really funny to watch the most delicate, protected, privileged people in America, which is obviously the left and the cultural left, now get a taste of their own medicine, and they're really struggling to understand how this could happen.
Yeah, it's been especially rewarding, I feel like, in the university systems. I mean, that's been my favorite part of this. So
I know, yeah. They're in big trouble. Like, what are they going to do? Like, and they can't understand it, and you know, they're really trying to straddle both sides. And to anything bad that happens to university is obviously a good thing for America and any decent human being. So it's wonderful to watch that.
So whenever you said that, you know, your article was called that you, or said that you were coming out as a conservative, was this a gradual realization for you, or had you always sort of harbored the positions that you talked about in the New York Post article?
Well, it's, you know, I'm super naive. I still to this day I'm really naive. Like, I think I'm quite stupid, to be honest. And at the time, like, I wasn't into politics at all. You know, I always voted Democrat because that's what you do if you're a good person, you know, and if you're like a gay guy and you're in the liberal arts and you live in New York City, like, you just voted Democrat, you know, because you know, you believe in all the bromides of, you know, equality and justice. And, you know, I'm not racist. I like science. So I'm a Democrat. But I just wasn't really paying attention. It didn't interest me. You know, I was writing human interest stories, features, investigative stuff. I mean, that's what's always interested me. And to this day, I really don't care about politics per se. I mean, I'm interested in people. I mean, I guess that's why anyone wants to be a writer. Maybe not anymore. I guess people get into it because they want to be activists, but that was never me. And I think that I've always had the same beliefs. I've certainly become galvanized on certain issues. I've changed my opinion on only two issues, and that's abortion and global warming. Those are the only two things I've done a 180 on. You know, otherwise I've always been, I think, the same person. I mean, my politics are sort of like, I'm from the leave me the hell alone party, you know? And it was before 2016, I would, you know, I'd be out with friends or whatever in some social setting and saying the usual things, and people would just kind of like chuckle it off and say, "Oh, you're such a contrarian." I never really understood that. And then, you know, once Donald Trump came onto the scene, I would be saying the same things about how I view the world or politics, and then suddenly it was like, "You're a racist and get out of here," and blah blah blah. And I'm like, wait, what's going on? Like, what happened? I think also, you know, a part of that being naive is I always had this kind of very rosy-eyed view of the media, and I always admired the media. I mean, I guess that's why I got into it. Like, you know, I always thought that you know, the New York Times or places like the New Yorker were you know, very respectable institutions, were populated by people who who were smart and wanted to pursue truth and wanted conversations and were interested in the world and in humanity and not activists. But I began to see that as not so much the case. And I think the first time that happened was 2013, late 2013. I went to Russia to write a story for The Advocate, to their cover story on gay rights in Russia. And at the time, that was like this huge news story all summer long, because Russia was gearing up to host the 2014 Winter Olympics in Sochi. And all over the pages of the New York Times, these places were, you know, stories about, like, you know, Putin's getting ready to throw the gays in concentration camps. And I'm like, well, I need to go. Like, hello, like, send me to Moscow. I need to, like, go to gay bars. I need to talk to these people. Like, what's happening? And then eventually, finally, they came up with a budget and sent me. And then that was like the first time when I was like, wait a minute, like, nothing that I'm reading in the media from these hallowed institutions that I believe are so smart and respectable. These journalists like I don't know what's his name, David Remnick or something. These nepo people. Nothing is actually true what they're saying. Like they haven't actually been here. I was the only Western journalist to go into Russia's gay scene at the time, and yet and again, this is a long time ago, but at the time it was like every day in the newspapers, gay rights in Russia, gay rights in Russia. Putin's attacking the gays. And it was a total farce. And not only it being a farce, it was, it just lacked so much perspective and a decent sense of inquiry on behalf of the media. So that's a long-winded answer to your question. That was really the first time that I was like, what? Like I came back and I'm like, what's going on here? Like these people, I'm still reading these stories and I'm like, well, I've actually been there, and I'm hanging out at gay bars in Russia. I'm going to like, the private country home of the guy who owns like the biggest gay bar in the country and blah, blah, blah. And the story is so much more interesting and complex and nuanced than I'm reading. So I think that when you begin to see the cracks in the media and you begin to see how absolutely stupid journalists are and lazy, and now I guess how much they're political activists and they're not actually curious about the world or curious about humanity. They're more interested in pushing an objective. That's when was probably the first time that I really began to question the world and see the cracks in the ceiling.
So did you get any pushback as you were going through the editorial process of publishing that story, or was it basically sort of a situation where you had freedom to say what you wanted to?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't think I've actually even said this before. I didn't really, but so the thing in Russia, they passed a law. I mean, laws in Russia are sort of meaningless, like in any sort of dictatorial country. Like they'll pass something like intentionally vague, so it can be applied in any way and if needed in the future, right? So they passed some law against like gay propaganda. This is what had stopped. This is what had sparked all the news stories, and it was something to do with like we were reading the law. It was basically like you can't propagandize homosexuality to children. Was sort of what was going on. Which maybe not on its face is a bad thing. And I was at some home of some guy and there were all these like, it was like a dinner party and there were all these like really fat, disgusting, old, wealthy Russians, like oligarchs, like gay oligarchs. And like, they're like exactly like the comic book picture you would imagine them to be when I described them that way. Like that's what they were. And there are all these young guys around. And I mean like young, like, and I remember asking the guy, like, are these, I didn't, there's nothing sexual happening that I saw. But they were like there as like arm candy. And I was like, are these guys like 18? And, the host's like, oh yeah, everyone, of course, blah, blah. They're just, here, whatever. And maybe that might've been the case, but they looked really young. And I remember I got back to my hotel and I emailed my editor. And I told him this story, and I was like, maybe this law is like, maybe there's a pedophile problem in this country. Maybe that's what this law is meant to do. Like, I want to kind of pursue this angle also in the story. And he was like, oh, no. He's like, you know what? Gays have been associated. He's like, well, do you have proof? Blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, no, but I'm just saying I was a little creeped out. And he said, gays have so historically been associated with pedophilia. Let's just don't go down that route. Just focus on what you're doing, blah, blah, blah. And I thought that was kind of strange because I thought that was, something that was more worth exploring. And I only had like 2 weeks in the country, so I couldn't, I had lots of things to tackle, but that was the only instance there. But even at the time, I thought that was really sort of bizarre. And I'd never been told up until that point, I'd never been told by an editor to not pursue a thread that I was kind of interested in and that might go somewhere. And I guess at the time I sort of understood what he was saying because that's true. But of course that was 10 years ago. And now here we are where it seems to be the mainstream LGBT position is children. So how interesting that is. And I've always had actually, he's older than I am. And, I've always had sort of respect for the older generation of gays who did live through that. And, so at the time I was like, okay, I understand. Like, I know that, your whole life you've been called a pedophile. But that was the instance in that story for sure.
So one of the most striking things about your book is we have this depiction of Tucker Carlson as this just far right extremist who's always been against legacy media. But your book lays out this case that Tucker Carlson was basically the Christopher Hitchens of the right. He was writing for all of these, I mean, very similar career path early on to someone like Hitchens or Tom Wolfe. And there was that sort of break that it seems very much happened with you, where Tucker went for Trump. Tucker went down that rabbit hole, and suddenly he was always on the outs and was never kind of one of the inside legacy gang. So, was that kind of the thread that you thought you would sort of base the book on as you were writing it, or did that happen as you were going through the research process?
Well, it became, I mean, I think it became kind of really intrinsic to understanding who he is. And he's, as you mentioned, like he's like an extremely literary guy. You don't get many of those in television. That might surprise your listeners to hear that. But you don't get many people who read a lot in television. And he's certainly the exception. And, I think if you want to really understand someone, especially someone who's into books and literature, I mean, that's sort of the path you go down. I mean, and it makes so much sense, like when you know him, when you like get to hang out with him, like it makes so much sense that those would be his idols. People you had mentioned. I think Christopher Hitchens to the right is certainly a good characterization. He idolized Hunter S. Thompson from a very early age. P.J. O'Rourke became a friend and personal hero of his later on, and I think that's really pivotal. So it became kind of, I just think a part of who he is. And also when you meet his dad, like his dad was this very much this kind of Jack Kerouac figure, probably minus the drugs, etc. But he was this kind of rambling 1960s young guy, 40s and 50s, who, just wanted to be a writer. He had that very much that ethos of, pick up your suitcase and hitchhike across America and get stories and etc. And he is, not only a really hilarious and warm and lovely guy, but really interesting guy, but also has that spirit and instilled that in his two children. Also, they very much looked down on television, reading magazines in their home. They were a book household, a literary household, and I don't think a lot of people understand that about Tucker. I think people with like a trained ear, when they would watch his show, would understand that he's a very literary guy. Those A block monologues, that's all his writing. He's a beautiful writer, and I got to enjoy so many of his old magazine articles and investigative reporting, and he very much embodied that kind of gonzo style of Hunter S. Thompson and others in his earlier writing. But those monologues, like that's all him, and any writer or any literary person would listen to those and get that he's this sort of a person. And that's part of the reason why, I took on this project, because even just listening to his monologues, I'm like, this guy's a writer. There's way more depth to this person than I think your casual viewer realizes. I found that certainly to be the case.
Yeah, and one of the more interesting passage of the book, and this is a book of interesting passages, is the way that the Jon Stewart crossfire disagreement, I guess is the polite way to put it, has been framed in pop culture. Because I went back when I read the book and took a look at this again, and Tucker pretty much in retrospect wipes the floor with him. I mean, brings up some really good points, but this is something that has been framed by legacy media as kind of like the moment Jon Stewart broke out from being the sort of hipster Daily Show guy to a bigger figure. And I even say in the book that he says to them at the end that, like, this is going to be great for my career, what I just did to you all. How important is that event to Tucker, or is this just kind of something that is a roadblock on his larger career?
Well, that ended Crossfire, at least according to executives at CNN. Jon Stewart came on this show, and I mean, and I remember this at the time too. He was portrayed as like this, like savior of America, Jon Stewart, when he did that, because he was saying, this show is what's wrong with America. It's the right arguing with the left. It's unproductive, and he was just sort of like, we need to come together voice of, I guess he was seen as sanity at the time. And it's so funny because look at him now and look at his entire side now. But and you're right. What I put in the book, which no one has reported, is what happened when the cameras turned off, and it's the fact that Jon Stewart is an absolute POS and absolutely knew what he was doing. He planned this, and he knew it was going to sell books, and he knew it was going to get and make him the number one cable show, and it worked. And it was totally calculated, and he said it all after the camera stopped rolling. He admitted to it, and then he was a total jerk and wouldn't have any of those people on his show afterwards. And I think that Tucker doesn't really I guess he doesn't really think about it. He admits that John had some good points to this day. He said that he was right about many things, and I think that was sort of it was after that Tucker really did begin to hate point scoring for a team, and just sort of blindly yapping for a side. And to this day, he'll say that, those are the people he hates the most. You can be totally wrong about something. You can be totally evil in your beliefs or stupid. But if you sincerely believe them, then he respects you. And I agree with that as well. I'm the same way. If you sincerely believe something, then you have my respect, even if you might be wrong. And I think a lot of that is missing. And I think Tucker, there certainly was a time in his life, a long time in his life, where he was this kind of beltway talking head neocon. But also he was quite young, and I think he was sort of finding his way and figuring it out.
Yeah, and even during that time, one of my favorite Tucker pieces is the Al Sharpton Liberia piece that you mentioned in the book. And I mean, that piece, there was always, I think, a distinct difference between the print Tucker and the TV Tucker until his time at Fox News. So can you speak to that a little bit too?
Oh, for sure. That piece is so funny. It's so good. He goes with Al Sharpton to Liberia, and which is Liberia. If your listeners don't know about Liberia, someone needs to write a really great book about the nation of Liberia. But he goes there, and it's really funny and really heartfelt. And he goes as this kind of like white conservative guy. And he's with a bunch of like black activists and like Nation of Islam people. They end up dubbing him Tucker X, like Malcolm X, but Tucker X. And it's so funny because that story, but like after Tucker's rise at Fox News, several liberal media journalists dug that up to say it was like the most racist thing ever. And I think it was published in Esquire. So like, okay, I guess Esquire is not racist. No, it was just a different time where like the races could sort of look at one another honestly and poke fun at one another, which I think, normal people do. Obviously not people who work in media can't do that. But that was a part of a lot of his he also for Esquire went to Iraq in 2023, and that was I would say probably one of the 2 or 3 big ideological changing points in his life. And he went there as a sort of Bush supporting pro-war Beltway neocon, and he was embedded with civilian contractors who were in Baghdad's green zone, and that experience is what like really turned him off neoconservatism, which I think his exact quote was, he realized that neocons are just liberals with guns, which are the most dangerous kind. That was kind of the beginning of him being ultimately a class traitor, culminating with Trump, and then carrying on after that. Betraying this kind of rarefied insular world of Washington D.C. that he'd known and grown up in.
And I remember when I first read that piece, it's probably like the most sterling example of how a white person going into the world of a perspective that is not typically well represented, just the way that he handles it and the ethics of the journalism is just incredible. It reminds me of Lester Bangs' Innocence in Babylon when he goes to Jamaica and sort of points out all the problems and really does deal with that issue of perspective. And that was something I did want to talk to you about because we're in the situation now where representation matters. You look at the Taylor Swift movie, and it just like it's painful the way that particular movie makes very obvious that it's trying to represent people in a very superficial way. But you're in this situation where you're representing a perspective from the LGBTQ community on Tucker Carlson. You've got a distinct perspective, but somehow your perspective doesn't seem to matter anymore to the people who disagree with you within the same identity politics group. So could you parse some of this out for us? Because it's something that I'm really struggling. The more we hear from people, the more sort of big tent that the movement that Tucker has started gets, it seems suddenly like there are two classes of African Americans. There are two classes of people from Latin America. There are two classes of people from the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. It's like these people, I'll speak for the gays. They, they're the first ones to be like, I mean, what do they have if not pretending to be like victims or oppressed or whatever? So, the first ones to be like, oh, the right, they're evil, they're homophobic, blah, 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 blah. And then you have people who are gay or like super, I don't want to say supportive because that's such a creepy term. Like I support gay rights, just like don't give a darn about it. People like Tucker. They drive, and I think this applies to any victim group. This applies to, black or whatever. Those on the left, they hate them the most because it fundamentally destroys their narrative. You would think if you were fighting some sort of like oppressive fascist force, which of course they are, and pretending to fight, you'd think if you were fighting that, you would really celebrate and embrace people of your community being on that side, maybe as like to influence politics or whatever. But of course, that's not the case. So Tucker is so funny. I mean, his executive producer is gay. Justin, I write about him in the book, is Tucker's right-hand man. He was fired the same day as Tucker. And then immediately went straight to the airport and flew down to Florida to be with him. And I mean, they're so boring at this point, right? I mean, like they have absolutely no ammunition, no argument, which is why they've gone full on into, I mean, I guess just straight up communism. Like that sounds like such a crank to use the word communism, and that's why I do. But they have nothing left. So like the drape has been dropped, and they are exposed to what they are. And I think that's kind of who they've always been. I didn't really realize that when I was kind of on the left and voting that way. I didn't realize the end game, but now they really have no choice because you have this plethora of Americans. And I think Donald Trump is really, changed the Republican Party fundamentally and for the best way possible. And Tucker Carlson has just sort of been a figurehead for that. He was always on his show. He's never like a go Trump rah 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 guy like Sean Hannity or something. Interesting enough, Sean Hannity, those other Fox immediately dumped Trump as soon as the memo came down. But Tucker was never like that. He was always he would rarely talk about Trump. He was more interested in the people who supported Trump. And that sort of plurality of voices. I mean, it's a very sort of libertine movement that Trump, I think, represents. And it certainly represents this shifting political paradigm where left and right don't necessarily mean the same things, conservative and liberal and Democrat and Republican. It's really hard to define what they are and what they believe in. And I think Tucker's like a face of that for sure.
And speaking of libertines, my grandmother's a huge Tucker Carlson fan, but I just can't bring myself to recommend this particular book for her because I was shocked at sort of the reality. I mean, I appreciated it because, working in journalism, left or right, like the environment that you create in this book is very much accurate to the way that journalists behave and talk. But, some readers who you mention often in the book are this over 65 Fox News demographic might be shocked about sort of the reality of Tucker Carlson, the squeaky clean, fancy tie guy they saw at 8:00 every night during his show. What do you think is sort of the biggest disconnect between Tucker's fans' perception of him and the portrait that you present in the book?
I mean, I do kind of, whenever I see like reviews or comments or people like, I love the book, but I don't like that language, my heart does kind of like break a little bit, but it is honest. I mean, and as you know, like you've been around them, that's how journalists behave. I mean, Tucker Carlson is certainly by far among the better behaved, probably the best behaved people in the industry, because it's an industry riddled with, cokeheads and alcoholics and sex fiends. And Tucker's, been sober 30 years. And as far as I know, has never had an indiscretion. He and his wife seem very extremely happy, like in the most inspirational and lovely way possible. But with Disconnect, I don't know. I think he's very much who he is, like on air. Like that's very much him. It was always sort of startling. I would say that he's. I think what people would find most surprising is that he's kind of like a little more toned down on air than he is in person, which is usually the opposite. So a lot of times you meet TV personalities and they're very kind of demure and meek, and then the camera rolls and they're like all energy. Tucker is like super energetic, and then the camera rolls and he kind of like becomes more serious. He's way more like excitable and goofy than I think people would understand. I think that's why it would be the biggest thing. It was always sort of a shock. Like I would go and like when I was hanging out with him, and then like go to the studio and watch his show, and he would just be like la, 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 like bantering with everyone, talking to somebody in his ear, talking to people in the studio. There'd always be like random locals who would come and sit and watch the show, and these are like folding chairs next to his desk that are like right there next to the camera, but you just can't see it. And he'd be palling around with everyone, and then like it's like you wouldn't know what would happen. Suddenly he would just be like, "Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson tonight." And you're like, "Oh shit, I guess we're live." It was just like the wildest thing. I also think people would be surprised to learn, I think, how deeply human he is, which was, lovely to see. And I think the extent to which he goes to be humble and to not think that he's God. And especially speaking in the context of when his show was on Fox, when he was on cable news, the extent to which he, reminds himself that he's like just some guy, and doesn't, believe any of the hype about himself, positive or negative.
So as I was reading this book, I really didn't envy you, because it was clear that you were trying to write this very balanced book. You were trying to exhaust all of your sources possible. You reached out to sources, and one of my favorite passages in the book's actually in the acknowledgement, when you just do this very pointedly acidic rocket to Media Matters whenever you try to involve them. And writing this book, I would have been stressed out the entire time, even more so than writing something this long form, because of the fact that you were really playing with half the information, because nobody would talk to you that were making these allegations against Carlson. How did you balance that as a writer, not having that information and still trying to tell this story where, you do a great job of maintaining objectivity throughout?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's obviously so much out there in print, on the record, of people talking about Tucker Carlson almost always negatively. So the material's there, and I really wanted to talk to these people, honestly, and give, I don't know what they thought I was trying to do, but I just wanted, have an honest conversation and get them for my book. No one would talk to me on the left. And people I really wanted to, like Bill Kristol and a bunch of others, they would just run and hide. Anyone from Media Matters, which probably spent, I don't know, a couple $100,000 a year on salaries for people whose only job was to watch Tucker Carlson and find like 2 seconds they can clip to launch an advertiser boycott or something. They wouldn't speak to me, and I was very surprised by that. But but then again, like I also think that I was focusing too much on that, and when it became evident that this wasn't going to happen, and I do put in the book, obviously what people say negatively about him that's out there on the public record, but it just became evident that it didn't matter. That's not the book that I'm writing. Like, who cares? Like, everyone knows who these people are. Everyone knows what they're going to say. It kind of felt unnecessary after I was getting shot down. I was like, well, why do I even care? That's not interesting. Like, the most interesting part of this book is Tucker Carlson, the human being. And we all know what people think about him, and throw in a quote here or there from Media Matters or some other disgusting human being for context. But that's not, it's really not even necessary. And I don't think it, I think it probably actually helped the book that I didn't have that in there, because it just keeps it focused on this guy. Like, everyone knows what you're going to say about him. What's he really like? Where does he come from? Yeah, it seems totally not needed after after the 30th unanswered email from Bill Kristol or whatever.
For sure. So something I did want to talk about is you were the one person in America during April of last year who were on the front lines of the dissolution of the relationship between Tucker and Fox News. And what most impressed me about the book was like it didn't tend toward that gossipy. Like you had the opportunity to do what Brian Stelter's probably going to do next week. And the book we read the excerpt from in Vanity Fair, where you were his friendly biographer, and it just kind of lifted passages from your book outright. So I'm this is kind of a double question here, but I really wanted to commend you for like not turning it into this like gossip book that could have driven even more sales than you've already gotten, which admittedly are very impressive sales for the book. You didn't know this was going to happen, obviously, when you started the project, right?
Yeah.
So how did you handle that? You built the relationship with Tucker. You see this just kind of horrible situation unfold that caught him and everyone else in America by surprise. Can you kind of take us back and walk us through sort of how you handled the project in those days?
I mean, I guess like again, I'm very naive and continue to be. But that whole kind of like palace intrigue BS that people like Brian Stelter pretend to have, you can see right through it if it's not genuine. You know what I mean? Like it's just like, oh, this guy doesn't know anything. He's trying to like get you. Here's the inside secret of Fox News. I couldn't get a single person to talk to me, but here's what's happening. That's very Brian Stelter. And that other guy, what's his name, Michael Wolff or something? He did the same thing. I don't know. I guess people are into that stuff, but I'm not if it's not genuine. I just wanted to tell a story about a person. I mean, I know it's not very sexy, but I think people are enjoying it. But when it comes with Fox, like we had no idea this was going to happen. In fact, like the day his show was taken off the air, the very day I had my last phone call scheduled with Tucker, which is basically like, hey, can you, I had like 5 questions. Like, can you elaborate on this more? Can you explain this more? Did I get this right? Etc. And then the show was taken off the air. So we ended up pushing back publication, and I interviewed Tucker a few more times after that. And I think the book ends at an unexpectedly good place. I remember my editor Harry, who's one of the most wonderful people alive, calling me the day that his show was taken off the air, which we all found out the same way everyone else did, like on Twitter. And like he sounded like he was like almost in tears, like, what are we gonna do? Oh my god. And I'm like, I don't know. But after the dust settled a bit, I was sort of like, this, I guess I think the best endings are new beginnings, and that's certainly where the book ends. It ends 2 weeks after his show was taking off the air, and he's sitting around his garden in Florida smoking a cigar, like, I don't know what the hell just happened. And I mean, that sort of seems like the real Tucker Carlson origin story. And that didn't become evident until it wasn't, when he came onto Fox and became the number one cable news host. It was the end of the origin story is really when his show was taken off the air, because now he's totally unbound and he's going to do something else interesting and new, we hope. And we'll get to see what, Tucker Fully Unleashed looks like.
And I wanted to just say, for those people in the audience who don't like Tucker Carlson or don't agree with Tucker Carlson, this is a book that you need to read because of the fact that it is actual journalism. It's not trying to trace trends. It's very well vetted. I mean, it does a great job of telling a narrative and sort of balancing the cultural implications of Tucker Carlson with his story. So it's one of the best books that I've read all year, and I really wanted to thank you for writing it.
Oh, that's really sweet. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Great. Well, Chadwick, thanks so much for joining us today. And we will be tweeting out links so you can get a copy of the book just in time for the holiday season. Have a great weekend.
Awesome. Thank you so much. You too.
Bye. All right. So thanks to Chadwick for joining us today. And again, I cannot highly recommend this book enough. Wonderful, wonderful read. So next we're going to get into one of my favorite films of the year, which I had the pleasure of seeing last Friday, Sofia Coppola's Priscilla. Which I think my review probably is coming out right now as the newsletter for the day launches. So Priscilla is based on Priscilla Presley's 1985 memoir, Elvis and Me. And speaking of tabloids, which we just talked about with Chadwick, there's been a lot since the release of Priscilla that Lisa Marie Presley's final wish was to have Elvis's portrayal softened in this particular film, and kind of the pushback between Sofia Coppola and this presentation of Elvis versus the presentation of Elvis that we saw in Baz Luhrmann's movie from last year starring Austin Butler and Tom Hanks. We've got an image of the trailer of Priscilla up now, and for those of our viewers who actually know a little bit about Sofia Coppola, familiar with her other work, she's a very distinctive filmmaker. She's one of my favorite filmmakers in the American cinema. I don't think she's made a bad movie. I would make the argument that she, in terms of her oeuvre, has been more consistent than her father, who directed The Godfather and The Conversation and Apocalypse Now. I mean, those are amazing American movies, but even though Sofia Coppola's movies are incredibly understated, just watching the trailer, you see a big difference from Baz Luhrmann's Elvis, which also I think is a really, really, really great movie as well. She's so focused on the inner lives of her characters. She's also one of the few directors, male or female, who can write both genders equally well, and really get into the interior minds of all of her characters. So, going into Priscilla, I was a little bit not sure what to make of it. This is Coppola's first collaboration with A24, which is the hipster film studio of the moment. One of the best things about this movie is that Coppola did not cast named stars. As much as I loved Baz Luhrmann's Elvis, Tom Hanks really took me out of it. It just seemed like a very hammy performance. I could never get past the fact that Tom Hanks was in this movie and it wasn't really the Colonel. The same thing with Austin Butler. I wasn't as familiar with his work whenever I saw Baz Luhrmann's Elvis, but you could tell this was a performance. This was not the actual character. Priscilla stars Jacob Elordi from the show Euphoria and Kaylee Spaney, who has had a lot of smaller roles on TV and film before this. So I don't want to say that these actors are unknown, because that's not true, but they're not breakout stars. They're not A-list celebrities yet in the same way that obviously a Tom Hanks is. And watching Elvis, at certain points, I felt like I was watching a documentary. And yes, I know that it wasn't a documentary. It's a Sofia Coppola movie. But the fact is, the performances are so understated. They're so interior that you feel like you're actually watching these moments from these characters' lives. And that's one of the greatest strengths of the movie. Coppola knows exactly what she's doing. She's not trying to make a corrective. A lot of the mainstream media depictions, I read a Polygon article that called this a direct rebuke to Baz Luhrmann's Elvis. And the kind of superficial idea is that Baz Luhrmann's Elvis was this portrait of Elvis Presley and what a great American icon that he was. And what Sofia Coppola is doing with Priscilla is providing the female perspective. Those of you familiar with film theory, inverting the male gaze and making it female. And that's a lot of BS. That's actually not what happens at all in Sofia Coppola's Priscilla. She's simply telling a different perspective of a story. And it's an ambivalent story. This Elvis is not a monster. He might do some monstrous things. My favorite scene in the film is one that's very, very early, and it's how I start out my essay on the movie that was published in the Pamphleteer today. And it's a scene where Elvis and Priscilla meet for the first time at Elvis's house. One of his friends has invited her because, Elvis is in the army at this point on a German air base and doesn't really have any connection. His mom has just died. And you have this scene of these like two hurt kids who don't really know who they are, who have these adults in their lives. In Priscilla's case, the military father, and in Elvis's case, the colonel and his own father, sort of telling him what to do. And he just sort of absentmindedly gives her some amphetamines and says, hey, they give us these in the army to keep us awake. And obviously, those of us who know about the Elvis mythos are like, oh gosh, like this is what happened. But, this isn't a melodramatic scene of Elvis in a Las Vegas dressing room doing a bunch of drugs and eating fried peanut butter sandwiches. This is kind of the moment where you see that this drug use was something that built over time. And he didn't really think it was a big deal at this point. And Priscilla didn't think much of it either. There's another great scene where she ends up in a 2-day coma almost because of some pills that Elvis gives her. But we really see just how unprepared both of these figures are for the lives that they're about to lead in the spotlight. The movie most closely resembles Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette. If you've seen that movie from 2006 starring Kirsten Dunst, it was the first American film that was ever allowed to shoot at the Palace of Versailles. And it's based on Antonia Fraser's biography of Marie Antoinette, which is famous because it's the only biography of Marie Antoinette that actually treats Marie Antoinette like she was a teenager who was tasked to be the Queen of France, which is the truth of the situation. When that movie came out, it was critically reviled. It didn't do well at the box office. Now it's considered this classic in a very similar way to Jennifer's Body, which is a movie we mentioned on the program a fair amount of time, and I've written about for the Pamphleteer. So this movie also treats Elvis and Priscilla as teenagers, 20-somethings who don't really know what's going on. So in some ways, it demystifies icons. She's not interested in toppling an icon. What she's interested in this is this American culture that builds up icons and then tries to tear them down, to try to pit them against representations like Baz Luhrmann's Elvis and Sofia Coppola's Priscilla as somehow this mutually exclusive category that can't exist in the same universe in any way that makes them simpatico. So I would highly recommend those of you that are looking for something to see this week. I know we're going to be talking about the weekly film rundown here in the next segment, but Priscilla is probably not going to be in theaters for very long just because it is a limited release. It's not playing at every single theater in the Nashville area, but it's playing at most of them. So this might be your next big chance before the Thanksgiving movies start to see the movie. I'm guessing maybe next week, if it sticks around in these theaters, it's going to be down to like one screening time or to half a screen. So if you get a moment this week and you're really looking for an amazing movie that's pretty much assured to be on my top 10 list of the year, give Priscilla a chance. I cannot recommend it enough. Just like Chadwick's book. I always love on these shows whenever I get to talk about things that I really, really, really love that are happening in pop culture at any given moment. And today is one of those days. So Priscilla, go see it. It's amazing. It's awesome. It's one of Sofia Coppola's best. And it shows us why she's one of the country's greatest directors. So we are going to move now into a fairly sparse weekly film rundown. I don't know what to make of a lot of these movies, but what I can tell you is this bit of trivia. The Marvels at 1 hour and 47 minutes is the most expensive movie per minute ever made in the history of Hollywood. It's nearing $300 million is what this movie cost. And it's an example of Hollywood that got out of control during the streaming era. Some of you may have seen the article this week where Christopher Nolan, director of Oppenheimer, was interviewed and talked about how this shift from streaming was basically what just destroyed actor revenue and what destroyed the film industry and why it's taking so long to recover after the pandemic. And what we're seeing with some of these bigger releases like The Flash and like The Marvels, which is the sequel to Captain Marvel, is that just because a brand exists does not mean that people are going to come out in droves to see it. The Marvels is on track to be the lowest opening in the history of the MCU, behind even 2008's The Incredible Hulk. Now, it looks like it might be a pretty fun, pretty interesting movie. Nia DaCosta, the director, recently did the Candyman remake in 2001, which I thought was a pretty solid film. I really enjoyed it. It held its own against the original. It's one of the better horror movies of the past 3 or 4 years. But we can't really deny the fact that a movie like The Marvels never needed to be made. Captain Marvel made $400 million. It was the highest grossing superhero film featuring a female of all time. But Captain Marvel was also a pretty boring movie. Kind of one of the problems of Marvel catering to identity politics is you have Captain Marvel, who is the most powerful superhero in the MCU, so you can't really put her in many of the other narratives. She doesn't have the flaws of somebody like Iron Man. Now, in the comics, she does. She's an alcoholic. Tony Stark helps her through some of that. But the girl power version of Captain Marvel that we see exist in 2019's movie Captain Marvel is kind of a boring character because of that. She's so powerful, she doesn't really have a real threat. And we've got this sort of shoehorned movie where we have Captain Marvel as the main draw, and then we have Miss Marvel, Kamala Khan from the Disney Plus TV series, and then we have Monica Rambeau from WandaVision, also a Disney Plus film series. So we're trying to juggle all of these characters in, and we can't help but notice a lot of this is like checking off some diversity boxes. There was not organic interest in this movie, but there wasn't also organic interest in the Miss Marvel series, which is one of Marvel's lowest rated series, but it became a pop culture touchstone because it was the first movie focusing on a Muslim superhero. Now, while these moments might be very important, in general, mass audiences just aren't that interested for these milestones that are happening. And that's what we're seeing at the box office this week when Captain Marvel tanks. I'm sure it's going to have some ancillary benefit, but one thing that's going to have to happen, as Variety pointed this week, is Marvel's going to have to get in control of spending and get back in control of their stories, because these characters are just not generating the same amount of interest that's going to be needed to sustain a movie that costs $300 million and really doesn't need to. So Marvel fans are going to go see the Marvels. I don't really know a lot of people that I've talked to, even hardcore Marvel fans, who are super excited about it. There's going to be some cool cat aliens, as always. That was one of the best parts of Captain Marvel. So I'm going to give this one a watch at some point. It's not at the top of my to-do list by any stretch of the imagination, but it is really your major release for the week. Also releasing this week is a very strange movie called Journey to Bethlehem, which is a musical retelling of the Christmas story featuring Antonio Banderas as King Herod. Very much like the Marvels, I don't really know that anybody was asking for this movie, but the sheer weirdness of the fact that Antonio Banderas is playing this role, fresh off a couple of Oscar nominations and some pretty solid, well-received turns in movies, it's interesting. I mean, it could be a train wreck. It could be kind of a underrated holiday classic. We're gonna have to check it out to know. I'm interested in seeing it at some point just for that sheer weird value of it. This week, we also have a couple of nice offerings from the Bell Court from the Repertory Gate. So Farewell, My Concubine is a Chinese film from 1993 that is considered kind of one of the major classics of Chinese and world cinema. And it's now gotten its 4K restoration. It is about two teenagers or two kids who start their careers out at the Peking Opera House, and it follows them through this coming of age story. Really amazing film. I've never seen it on a big screen. If I get a chance, I would love to be able to check this out. It is playing all week at the Bell Court because it is a re-release. It's not just like a special screening as they're tend to do. So I would recommend that if you've got the 3 hours to do it. This week also, we're preparing for Nicolas Cage's new movie Dream Scenario, which is supposed to be a kind of a return to form for Nicolas Cage. I would argue Nicolas Cage has never really left his form. But it's a film that's getting a lot of Oscar buzz, directed by Christopher Borgli, who's Sick of Myself we reviewed earlier this year. In preparation for Dream Scenario coming out over the next couple of weeks, the Bell Court is doing a special midnight series this weekend directed at Nicolas Cage. So first up tonight at 11:59 is going to be Nicolas Cage's 2018 cult hit Mandy. If you've not seen Mandy, I would recommend going to this. Mandy is an indispensable film. The tone, the mood, Nicolas Cage's performance in this movie, the weirdness of things like the Cheddar Goblin. It's a cult classic that has to be seen to be believed. So definitely check that out. Saturday, though, and this might be special to my fellow 90s kids, the Bell Court is doing a midnight screening of Simon West's 1997 hit Con Air. Very famous for the Nicolas Cage line, "Put the bunny back in the box." Steve Buscemi's in this movie as this sort of weird character. It's about essentially exactly what the title says. A bunch of convicts are being traveled and they break out of prison, including John Malkovich's Cyrus the Virus. And Nicolas Cage is Cameron Poe, a hero that's just trying to get back to his wife. They want to dance to a Leanne Rimes song. That's all they want to do, but he had to go to jail because of a bar fight. And Cameron Poe is the strong, masculine sinner that's going to write Con Air and save the world. It's hokey, but it's also amazing. It just really couldn't have been made out of that decade of the 90s. And this was the movie Nicolas Cage made right before he made Face Off. Both of these were huge blockbuster hits, and it really sort of solidified him as an A-list actor. So, I've not seen this movie in years. I may check it out this weekend if I've got the time, but definitely worth a watch. The only other major release coming out this week is a very strange horror movie called It's a Wonderful Knife. And yes, it sounds like It's a Wonderful Life for a reason. This is another kind of strange film. King Herod, played by Antonio Banderas, was not on my bingo card for the year in movies 2023. Neither was Justin Long and Joe McHale being in a movie about a young woman who saves a bunch of people from a serial killer and then one Christmas Eve wonders what would happen if she'd never been born. It's got kind of a tongue-in-cheek Scream vibe if you watch the trailer. I'll probably be checking this one out at some point. Reviews have been pretty solid, so this looks like it has sleeper hit written all over it. One of the really cool things about this year is we have a nice selection of actual holiday movies. There's The Holdovers that I talked about last week, which is expanding this week, the Paul Giamatti, Alexander Payne movie that is set during Christmas break at a boarding school and kind of promises to be this perennial classic. But we've got It's a Wonderful Knife. We've got Journey to Bethlehem. So there's a lot of offerings at the multiplex to get us through the holiday season, so we don't have to watch the umpteenth version of It's a Wonderful Life or Miracle on 34th Street or Die Hard. So I'd recommend checking some of these out. Hopefully they'll be playing through most of the season. And that is our show for today. We're going to have links posted throughout the weekend on the Pamphleteer and on my personal social media. So whatever you get up to this weekend, give it some thought. This is me signing off. Have a great one.